You know what finally made me rethink how I build things? It wasn't a YouTube video or a fancy new tool. It was standing in a boatyard in Maine about 6 years ago, watching a 70-year-old shipwright replace a plank on a wooden schooner that was built in 1923. That plank had been underwater for 100 years, and the method he used to fit the new one was identical to techniques I later found described in shipbuilding manuals from the 1700s. Same tools, same logic, same results. And that's when it hit me. These old shipwright methods didn't die. They just went quiet, kept alive in working boatyards and naval restoration shops, while the rest of the world moved on to plywood and epoxy. Today, I'm going to walk you through 20 of those secrets, spanning from the Vikings all the way through the Age of Sail, and I'll show you where each one still survives. Plus, stick around to the end because I've got a grain-reading trick I picked up from a restorer in Mystic, Connecticut that changed how I lay out every project. Let's get into it. What we're really talking about here is 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge about how wood behaves in the harshest environment on Earth, the open ocean. These aren't decorative techniques. Every single one of these methods exists because failure meant the ship sank and people drowned. And the remarkable thing is how many of them are still in daily use, if you know where to look. To understand why these methods work the way they do, you have to understand what shipwrights were up against. From the Viking longships of the 8th century through the towering warships of the 1800s, wood was the only structural material available for ocean-going vessels. And the ocean is constantly trying to destroy everything you build. Saltwater, wave stress, marine borers, temperature swings, constant flexing. A ship isn't a house. It moves, it twists. Every joint is under dynamic load every second it's afloat. So these builders developed an approach that was less about fighting nature and more about understanding it deeply enough to work within its rules. They matched specific species to specific jobs. They read the grain the way a surgeon reads an X-ray. They designed connections that got stronger with exposure to water instead of weaker. And they built flexibility into the structure itself because they knew a rigid ship is a dead ship. I've spent years visiting yards where these traditions survive, from Scandinavian boat shops to naval dockyards in England to restoration yards along the New England coast. And the same 20 secrets kept showing up over and over, no matter where I went. The first secret is riven planks, split along the grain instead of sawn. Vikings didn't saw their planking timber. They split oak logs radially using wedges and a froe, following the natural grain lines of the wood. This produces a plank where every fiber runs unbroken from end to end, which makes it dramatically stronger and more water-resistant than a sawn board where the saw cuts across grain lines at random angles. Today, traditional boat builders in Scandinavia still reeve planks for clinker-built boats, and high-end coopers use the same method for watertight barrel staves. If you've ever wondered why a split piece of firewood resists water better than a sawn board, this is the reason. The second secret is compass timber, sometimes called grown timber. Instead of cutting curves from straight stock and losing cross-grain strength, shipwrights sought out trees that had naturally grown into the curve they needed. A branch junction, a leaning trunk, a root flare. The grain follows the curve, so the piece is enormously strong in the shape it already occupies. Wooden boat restorers today still spend weeks walking forests and hedgerows looking for these natural crooks. It's slow, it's old-fashioned, and nothing modern can match the result. The third secret is ship's knees, which are a specific application of compass timber. Where a deck beam meets the hull side, you need a bracket that can handle enormous racking forces. Shipwrights harvested these from the natural junction where a branch meets a trunk, typically in oak or hackmatack, which is eastern larch. The grain flows continuously through the angle, making a knee that's nearly impossible to break along the joint. The United States Navy used ship's knees through the entire age of sail, and restorers working on historic vessels still source them the traditional way today. The fourth secret is tree nails, pronounced trunnels. These are wooden pegs, usually 1 to 1.5 inches in diameter, driven through planking and frames to hold the hull together. They were typically made from black locust or white oak, and here's the genius. When the tree nail gets wet, it swells and locks tighter into the hole. It never rusts. It never creates a galvanic reaction with surrounding metals. It actually gets stronger in service. The USS Constitution, which is still a commissioned warship, is held together with locust tree nails to this day. Modern restorers wouldn't dream of replacing them with bolts. The fifth secret is lignum vitae bearings. Lignum vitae is one of the densest woods on Earth, about 80 pounds per cubic foot, and it contains natural oils that make it self-lubricating. Shipwrights used it for stern tube bearings, the bearing that supports the propeller shaft where it exits the hull. Here's what surprised me. The United States Navy continued specifying lignum vitae stern tube bearings on warships well into the 20th century, and some modern commercial vessels still use them. They outlast synthetic bearings in dirty water because the wood is naturally lubricated and won't score the shaft. The sixth secret is live oak, the species the early American Navy prized above all others for warship hulls. Live oak, Quercus virginiana, is so dense and interlocking in its grain that cannonballs would embed in the hull without shattering the surrounding planking. The USS Constitution earned the nickname Old Ironsides specifically because enemy shot bounced off her live oak hull. The Navy maintained live oak reserves in the southeastern United States for decades. Today, restoration projects on historic warships still source live oak from those same coastal forests. The seventh secret is elm for keels and underwater planking. English elm has an interlocking grain that makes it almost impossible to split, and it is remarkably durable when kept permanently submerged. Shipwrights knew that elm would rot quickly if allowed to dry out and re-wet, but kept constantly underwater. It would last for generations. Traditional boatyards in England still specify elm for keels, and if you've ever seen the remains of a medieval ship excavated from a riverbed, chances are the elm keel is the best preserved piece. The eighth secret is greenheart, a tropical hardwood from South America that is naturally resistant to marine borers and nearly impervious to rot in saltwater. Shipwrights and dock builders used it for anything that would be submerged in tropical waters, where the teredo worm, the dreaded shipworm, could destroy an oak hull in a single season. Greenheart pilings installed in Caribbean ports over 100 years ago are still standing and still sound. Modern marine engineers specify it for lock gates and harbor structures to this day. The ninth secret is oakum and tar caulking. Shipwrights took old hemp rope, picked it apart into loose fibers called oakum, and drove it into the seams between hull planks, using a caulking iron and mallet. Then they sealed the seam with hot pine tar or pitch. The oakum swells when wet, and the tar keeps water from penetrating the fibers. This method sealed wooden hulls for centuries, and it's still the standard for traditional wooden boat maintenance. Every working wooden vessel I've ever visited gets its seams recaulked on a regular schedule using exactly this method. The 10th secret is lofting, the practice of drawing the ship's hull lines, full size, on a smooth floor called the mold loft. Before a single piece of timber was cut, every frame, every plank shape, every curve of the hull was drawn out at 1:1 scale so that patterns could be taken directly from the floor. This eliminated accumulated measurement errors and gave the builders a complete picture of how every piece related to every other piece. Restoration yards and custom wooden boat shops still loft their hulls on the floor. I've walked across loft floors in Maine where the lines from 3 different boats were layered on top of each other in different colored chalk. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The 11th secret is the adze, a curved cutting tool swung like a hatchet, but with the blade oriented perpendicular to the handle. Shipwrights use the adze to fair hull planking and shape frames, removing wood in controlled scoops that follow compound curves no flat-soled plane could ever reach. A skilled adzeman can fair a hull surface to within a 1/16 of an inch. Boat builders in traditional yards from Nova Scotia to the Philippines still reach for the adze before any other tool when fairing a hull. The 12th secret is steam bending. By sealing frames and planking stock inside a steam box for roughly 1 hour per inch of thickness at around 212 degrees Fahrenheit, shipwrights could bend thick oak and ash frames around the hull shape and let them set in place as they dried. This preserved continuous grain around tight curves instead of cutting the shape and losing strength. Every traditional boatyard I visited has a steam box, and the technique is identical to what was used 300 years ago. Nothing has improved on it because nothing needs to. The 13th secret is copper sheathing. Starting in the late 1700s, the Royal Navy began sheathing the underwater portions of warship hulls with thin copper plates. The copper was toxic to marine organisms, preventing both shipworm and the heavy fouling of barnacles and weeds that slowed a vessel down. This single innovation gave the British fleet a speed advantage that changed naval history. Modern wooden boat owners still use copper-based bottom paints, and some traditional vessels still carry actual copper sheeting below the waterline. The 14th secret is the scarf joint. When shipwrights needed a keel or plank longer than any single timber available, they spliced two pieces together using long, angled, overlapping cuts called scarfs, typically at a ratio of 8:1 or 12:1 length to thickness. The large glue surface and gradual transition of forces make a properly cut scarf joint nearly as strong as a solid timber. Wooden boat builders today cut scarfs the same way, and the joint shows up in timber framing, aviation, and even modern wooden boat kits. The 15th secret is sacrificial planking and tar. Shipwrights knew that the outermost layer of a hull would take the worst abuse from water, abrasion, and marine growth. So they designed hulls with sacrificial outer planking that could be stripped and replaced without disturbing the structural hull underneath. They coated everything with pine tar, which penetrates the wood fibers and creates a hostile environment for rot fungi. This layered defense strategy still governs how wooden boats are maintained in every traditional yard I've ever set foot in. The 16th secret is the side axe, sometimes called a broad axe. Unlike a standard hatchet, the side axe has a flat face on one side and a beveled face on the other, allowing the shipwright to dress a timber to a flat surface while standing right next to it. It removes wood fast and leaves a surprisingly clean face. Timber framers and shipwrights in heritage yards still use side axes daily, and if you've ever admired the tooled surface on an old hand-hewn beam, you're looking at side axe work. The 17th secret is reading grain direction for maximum strength. Shipwrights examined every piece of timber before cutting, looking at how the grain ran relative to the curves and stresses the piece would face in the hull. They oriented the grain so that tension loads ran parallel to the fibers, never across them. A plank with the grain running out to the surface would fail under stress, where a properly oriented piece would flex and hold. This isn't guesswork. It's the single most important material selection skill in traditional wooden boat building, and experienced restorers can read a board's grain in seconds. The 18th secret is long-term timber seasoning. Shipwrights didn't kiln dry their timber over a weekend. They air-dried it for years, sometimes a decade or more, stacked in open sheds where air could circulate around every board. The rule of thumb was 1 year of drying per inch of thickness for hardwoods, and even longer for structural pieces that needed to be completely stable. This slow seasoning allowed internal stresses to release gradually, producing timber that wouldn't twist, check, or move after installation. The best traditional boatyards today still maintain years-long inventories of air-drying stock. The 19th secret is matching species to specific structural roles. Shipwrights never used one species for the whole ship. They assigned each wood to the job it was best suited for. White oak for frames because of its strength and rot resistance. Elm for the keel because it could handle permanent submersion. Pine or cedar for planking because of their lightweight and workability. Locust for tree nails because of its density and durability. Hackmatack for knees because of its natural crooks and resilience. This isn't tradition for tradition's sake. It's engineering, and modern wooden boat designers still follow essentially the same species assignments. The 20th secret, and the one that ties everything else together, is designing the hull to flex rather than resist the sea. A wooden ship is not a rigid box. It's a flexible shell that moves with wave action, absorbing and distributing stress across thousands of individual joints and fastenings. Every technique I've described today, the tree nails that swell, the riven planks with continuous grain, the steam-bent frames, the caulked seams that can breathe, all of them serve this one overriding principle. The ship must move with the water, not fight it. Modern fiberglass and steel boats are engineered for rigidity, and they crack under fatigue. The old wooden hulls flex, and they survive. That philosophy is the deepest secret of all. Now, let me share a few patterns I've noticed over the years, things most of us do by default that these shipwrights would have found strange. I did all of these myself for longer than I care to admit. The first pattern is relying on metal fasteners for everything. We reach for screws and bolts without thinking. Shipwrights understood that every metal fastener is a future failure point, either from corrosion, galvanic reaction, or stress cracking. Their first instinct was always a wooden connection, and metal was a last resort. The second pattern is trusting kiln-dried lumber straight from the store. We assume if it says kiln-dried, it's ready to use. Shipwrights knew that wood needs time to reach equilibrium with its environment. They would have been horrified at the idea of building anything structural from lumber that was dried in a matter of days rather than years. The third pattern is using one species of wood for an entire project because it's convenient. We buy a stack of red oak and build the whole piece from it. Shipwrights matched every species to its specific structural role because they knew each wood has strengths and weaknesses that matter when the load is real. The fourth pattern is designing for rigidity instead of flexibility. We glue everything, we add cross-bracing, we try to eliminate all movement. Shipwrights designed movement into the structure because they knew that a joint that can flex slightly will outlast a joint that's locked rigid and eventually cracks. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start making different choices one project at a time. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is something I picked up from a restorer in Mystic, Connecticut, who had been working on wooden ships for over 40 years. When he needed to determine grain direction on a plank, he didn't just look at the end grain or run his hand along the surface. He took a sharp marking knife, held it at about 30 degrees, and drew it lightly across the surface at a diagonal. If the knife caught and dug in, he was going against the grain. If it slid smoothly, he was going with it. He did this on both faces and both edges of every board before he ever made a layout mark. He told me that understanding exactly how the grain runs through a specific board, not just generally but precisely, is worth more than any measurement you'll ever take. I started doing this on every project about 4 years ago, and he's right. It takes 10 seconds, and it has saved me from tear-out, weak orientations, and grain blowout more times than I can count. Before you head out, I want to make sure you know about my book, Secrets of the Shipyard. It goes way deeper than any single video can, with 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques, 25 hand-drawn illustrations, and 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. If you want to bring these old shipwright methods into your own shop, this is the guide to do it. Just scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the description to get your copy. Thanks for spending time with me today, and if you have not already, hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next one.